My name is Lorenzo Vidino, and I'm the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. I'm delighted to have a conversation today about the Muslim Brotherhood in light of the debate that we've seen in the US about the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood. There have been two bills introduced in the House and the Senate about designating the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's been quite a debate in Washington about the group and the process of designation. We thought that it would be, to advance the conversation, we thought it would be important to have somebody that has worked most of his career on the topic and that has actually worked on it both as an academic but as a diplomat, as a policymaker. And I have the enormous privilege of hosting Sir John Jenkins today for a conversation about the Muslim Brotherhood. Sir John had a 35-year-long career in the British diplomatic service. He was ambassador to Syria, to Iraq, to Saudi. He was the Foreign Office Director for the Middle East and North Africa. And in 2014, he was tasked by then Prime Minister David Cameron to lead the review into the Muslim Brotherhood. So I cannot think of anybody more qualified to discuss how a government can look into the Brotherhood. So, Sir John, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very, very welcome. It's a great pleasure, Lorenzo.
Let me start with a question on what is a review? How did the British government decide to do the review, and what did the review entail? Because it's an interesting process in itself.
Well, I was phoned up actually in the March, I think it was, of 2014 by David Cameron's national security advisor. David Cameron, of course, was the Prime Minister at the time. Who said, will you do a policy review of the Muslim Brotherhood? So I said, fine, what exactly does that mean? What do you want? And he said, well, we want to understand what the Muslim Brotherhood actually is, how it's come to be what it is now, and what the implications are for the United Kingdom, both in terms of its domestic policies, which of course also involves sociological issues like social cohesion, and the impact it has in the Middle East and North Africa in particular, and what that means not just for our foreign policy but for our relations with states in the region, many of whom take a particular view of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Islamism more generally. So I said, fine. So there's a set of discussions we had about how we would do it. I said that I would need quite a lot of support in terms of officials in London and facilitations, and also someone to hold the archives of our interviews and so forth. And that was all done. So what we then decided was that I would write. There were two chapters to the review. One was external, what the Muslim Brotherhood means externally, which is mostly in the Middle East and North Africa. Although I did say at the time, if you want to do this properly, you need also to consider South Asia, you need to consider Southeast Asia and so forth. And a colleague of mine, the late Charles Farr, who was ex-MI6 and Home Office, and was then in charge of the counterterrorism bit of the Home Office, would write the domestic chapter of this. And they were quite different because the impact of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamisms in Muslim majority countries is different to the impact that it has in the West, for example, as you know, and I've documented extremely extensively.
So what parts of the British government were involved?
Well, it was slightly unusual because I was a serving ambassador at the time, and I was approached directly by Number 10, which is fine by me, although it caused a certain amount of concern in some parts of the Foreign Office that Number 10 were bypassing them, including, I think, the Foreign Secretary. But that's the prerogative of the Prime Minister. Why they chose me, I think they chose me partly because of my background, because I'd spent so many years in the Middle East and North Africa. I spoke Arabic, had extensive contacts across the region. And I think because I was known for having quite robust views about a whole range of different things. And I reported directly to Number 10, to the Prime Minister. So the real commissioning meeting was a meeting I had with Charles and with David Cameron and a couple of other people about a few weeks after I'd been approached. What I also said at the time was, we can write the descriptive bit of this, and we can suggest policy areas and areas where policy recommendations need to be made. But if you want a set of policy recommendations which go to the Prime Minister, go to the Cabinet, that has to be staffed through a ministerial committee before it goes to the Prime Minister. So there was a certain complexity in the arrangements we made, not for submitting or preparing or submitting the review, but for preparing and submitting the policy recommendations, because I didn't think it was appropriate for me, even as a senior ambassador, to send policy recommendations direct to the Prime Minister without these being scrutinized in some way by a cabinet committee. And that actually worked pretty well.
What agencies were involved?
So I'll tell you what the process was. So externally, so I personally visited, I think it was 12 or 13 different countries. So I submitted the review in the November, or late November, early December of 2014. So I had about 6 months to do it. And I visited about 12, 13, maybe 14 countries in that period in the region, and interviewed on my own, probably getting on for 70 ministers, senior officials of intelligence agencies, academics, commentators, Muslim brothers themselves, other Islamists, with a series of structured interviews, which we had agreed beforehand with lawyers in the Cabinet Office. Charles Farr in the UK did something similar, but in the context of the UK. And so a lot of this was open source. A lot of it was driven by the interviews we ourselves conducted. And between us, we probably conducted 120 separate interviews in that period, which I think is pretty extraordinary. I think even the most active and diligent academic would struggle to do that. We recorded all these interviews because I insisted on having people there from our embassies to take notes. These are all recorded and stored in the archives. And we also drew on intelligence and other materials to inform and shape the conclusions. So there's a range of different things. I also commissioned a set of diplomatic reports from our posts worldwide to report on how our posts saw the issues and what their host government thought of it as well. So, I mean, even though I say so myself, it was a pretty rigorous and extremely thorough process.
So 6 months, a lot of people involved. I know also on the domestic side, I had the pleasure of working as an external expert with
I mean, we commissioned
Charles, and it was
We also did. I mean, I personally conducted a huge literature review at the same time, including a lot of your books, but also a lot of books by people who take a slightly different view of Islamism and look at other aspects of Islamism, particularly on the Salafi side, and indeed the Shia side, because you can't divorce Shia Islamists from Sunni Islamism. They are intertwined in extremely interesting ways, as we've seen graphically since then.
So the final product was a very lengthy report, which my understanding is has never been made public, which is remarkable because everything gets leaked these days, and that report has never been leaked. But what I know is public is basically an executive summary, which is on 10, 12 pages long. Can you sort of guide us through the findings?
So the review itself, my part of the review is about 120 pages, of which around 70 were very detailed, close-written notes. So there's a huge apparatus of supporting evidence. And Charles was about the same. So the whole thing was book length. And it was never designed to be a public. This was supposed to be an internal review of policies. So it was designed to look at how we, as a government, collectively, and how the Foreign Office and other individual ministries had approached the issue of Islamism in the region, but also domestically. So it was Foreign Office plus Home Office, putting it crudely. And it was never meant to be made public. A lot of the interviews we conducted were conducted under privilege. We had intelligence and other information which we used, appropriately caveated. I mean, this wasn't something that we simply believed everything that everybody told us. We didn't. We scrutinized, examined, and tested what people told us. But there was a lot of sensitive information in it, and it was designed to be an internal review. So I submitted the review just before I left the Foreign Office at the very beginning of 2015. The idea then was that the Prime Minister would make a written statement to the House of Commons. So it would be a statement which he would present orally, but it would be written down and kept in the House of Commons library, which is what he did. Now I'm trying to remember the exact timing of that. It was some time after I had written the review that the Prime Minister makes his statement. There was a lot of toing and throwing in London about what the statement should say, how detailed it should be, how much of the review it should cover. I mean, in the end, the statement, which is what when people say to me, I've read the Muslim Brotherhood review, what they mean is that they've read the written statement, which Cameron made in the House of Commons. That statement I did not write, although it is an accurate representation of the main conclusions of the review. I saw it and made some very light editorial changes to it before it was issued. One of the interesting things about that statement was that, you know, we were constantly being told by people, including people like Ibrahim Munir in London, the late Ibrahim Munir, who at one point became the acting murshid of the Ikhwan, that he had nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. We, by which I mean the government, then get a lawyer's letter, a notice of action letter. I think it was on the Friday or Saturday before the Prime Minister was due to stand up in the House of Commons on the Monday or Tuesday, asking him to cease and desist. Now, I found two reasons, and this was in the name of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was a very expensive set of lawyers who were saying the Muslim Brotherhood don't want you to do this. There were two things that struck me about this. One is that the Muslim Brotherhood constantly told me they didn't exist, and that the people we thought were in the Muslim Brotherhood went in the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, it turned out they were, or they thought they were. The second thing, trying to stop the Prime Minister standing up at the House of Commons and making a statement on these sort of issues is contrary to the Bill of Rights of 1688. I mean, it is just was an extraordinary thing to do. But it shows the way, the sensitivity of the whole issue, and it also shows actually the brother, whoever commissioned that lawyer's letter, had a lot of money to spend, because lawyers don't come cheap. Anyway, Treasury solicitors pushed back as they should, so the Prime Minister stood up and did it, and nothing happened. The world didn't end.
Okay. In a nutshell, what would be the findings on both sides, on the foreign and a bit less maybe on the domestic side? What does the review say?
Well, as briefly as I can, to understand Islamism, you have to understand the history, where this comes from. So we went into that in some detail. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, it emerges in Egypt in 1928, and it is the mothership of all subsequent organized Islamisms. Islamisms are not Islamism. I mean, I say Islamisms because there were various manifestations, and it's very protean the way it keeps evolving. Islamism is not a return to an authentic past. It's an attempted return to an imagined past, a reimagined Islamic past, which has purity and authenticity and all these things in it. In that sense, it is a highly modernist social network movement. That's what it is. And I said at the time, in response to some criticism, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is not SMERSH or the Comintern. It's essentially a very sophisticated, very rooted social network with a history. And you have to understand the social history, and you have to understand the nature of social networks in the Middle East. It's a form of a clan. It's become a sort of modernist clan type network. And that gives it huge resilience, particularly at times of persecution. And we saw that in the 1960s and 1970s, and we've seen it since, actually, in places like Syria. And it also makes it very hard to track, because what you're looking at are these filaments of personal relationships, of social relationships across boundaries, across borders. It is transnational. The goal of the Muslim Brotherhood from the start was the re-establishment of some sort of international global Muslim community, who would then form some sort of global political community under some sort of a single religio-political authority. There was the Brotherhood, like all Islamists, have always had a yearning for the return of the Caliphate. Now, whether these things are achievable or not, I think that's clear. And this fundamentally arises from their understanding of revelation. And revelation tells them what political order looks like, what social order looks like, and what illegitimate order looks like. And my problem with Islamism as a whole is that its insistence that revelation, the revelation contained in the Quran and the Hadith, is the only way in which you can legitimately order a society, a religion, and a political community, is fundamentally counter to the Western tradition of secular, rationally discovered law. And I've written about this. There is the issue of violence and their approach to violence. The people will say, famously, the Brotherhood in Egypt in 2013 were bearing their chests and saying, "We are peaceful." Silmiyin. Actually, if you look back at the history of the Brotherhood, certainly after about 1939, when Hassan al-Banna makes his famous address, fifth address to the annual Congress of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he enunciates a theory of physical force, of change by physical force. It's quite vague, but it's there. And they set up the special apparatus and the Nizam al-Khas and so forth. Now, it was in the context of a culture of street violence at the time. But this combination of the appeal to religious authority and the justification through religious authority of violent revolution or violent change was poisonous at the time and has become even more poisonous since then. It is true, I think, that the Brotherhood, their theory of violence is a prudential theory of violence, as it were. That violence, you can use violence to overthrow a state if you think it's going to work. It's not, for the Brotherhood, it is not the sort of radical brutality that you get in later forms of Islamism, like practiced by Daesh and others, which come out of a range of other theoretical texts, particularly the management of savagery by Abu Bakr Naji. But there is a continuum and there is a continuity in the fundamental tenets of Islam, which you can trace back to the Brotherhood in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
I mean, the executive summary, the part that is made public of the review, says that openly that the Brotherhood is sort of the intellectual origin of contemporary jihadism, yes, and that parts of the Brotherhood have not abandoned violence, and that at best it keeps an ambiguous relationship towards violence. It supports Hamas. So it's very clear in the review. Despite all this, and of course I'm leaning to, and we also have to close in a minute or so. Yeah. The debate in the US right now, it's about the designation of the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Despite your findings in the UK, there was no decision, or I'm not sure there was even a process to designate the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Yeah,
there are two issues with this. One is, how do you know if somebody is a Muslim brother? And what exactly is the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, there's nothing in the UK that is incorporated. There's no body that's registered as a Muslim Brotherhood. There are people whom we think have links to Hamas, or whom we know have links to Hamas, or other organizations of the same sort. But nobody says they're the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's interesting, if you read some of the testimony, so the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons ran a series of hearings on the Muslim Brotherhood review, tendentious hearings, I might say, in, I think, 2016. And you have someone like Anas Takriti, who runs the Cordoba Foundation in the UK, whose father was a very senior figure in the Iraq Islamic movement, which was the Iraqi version of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And he says, I'm not Muslim Brotherhood. I've never been Muslim Brotherhood, but I agree with most of what they say. Now that's, so how do you deal with that? I mean, he's not doing anything that's illegal. And if you tried to prescribe for example, for the sake of argument, the Cordoba Foundation on the basis of the suspicion that it had links to the Muslim Brotherhood, it will be thrown out of court, and that's a problem. So whatever you do has to be able to stand up in court. I do think there are two interesting things though that happened. When I wrote the Muslim Brotherhood review in 2014, when it's published, a lot of people, including a lot of commentators whom I respect, commentators on Islam and Islamism whom I respect, came out and said, this is nuts. Why is Cameron doing this? Now nobody says that. And of course, the French have now just produced their own review of the Muslim Brotherhood. They consulted me on it. They consulted a lot of other people. I'm sure they consulted you on it, which is very interesting. Most of that is centered on what's happening inside France. But people take this issue seriously now, the Muslim Brotherhood issue, in a way they didn't in 2014, 2015. And that seems to be an interesting and that, of course, is caused by, I think, fears of the impact of organized movements which use or exploit Islamism to identify gaps in social cohesion in our own countries. So we're seeing this in France, we're seeing it elsewhere. The second thing is, I said at the time to Cameron, given that it's difficult, you're chasing ghosts a lot of the time when you're doing this, look at the money and look at where the money's going. If you have people who are sending money to Hamas, and Hamas in this country, as in many other countries, is a prescribed organization, this is illegal. If they're doing that, they are supporting Islamism. And that is something you can do something about. That actually that's been very effective in the United States in a not in a consistent way, but from time to time over the last 25 years. For me, that's the way you go.
John, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I think there will be a lot of conversations going on in the US, and hopefully we can have you back. My sense is that this is something we'll discuss in the administration and in Congress for quite some time. But knowing about the British experience, I think, is very important for policymakers and the public. So thank you very much again, and till next time.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.